Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you so much for joining us for our third lovely gathering in this, our NENA Narratives Week, the week where those of us inside the New Economy Network Australia and beyond come together to talk about how stories can change our world, and in our particular area of interest, how they can change the economy. I'm just going to share screen and introduce the week of stuff we've been doing, but also introduce our wonderful speakers and my co-conspirators today in our presentations and discussions. So if you are just joining in for the first time, today is day 3 of our NENA Narratives Week, and the recordings from all of our sessions will be available on the NENA website. Some of the earlier sessions will probably be available by the end of the week, and the whole week's worth will be accessible by next week. I'd like to acknowledge country and invite you all to do the same. I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people on this call today who are joining us. Inside the New Economy Network Australia, we're really proud to be working in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across a range of areas, and always like to recognise the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation as well. And NENA has been involved in decolonising conversations for quite some time, and if anyone's interested in accessing more of that, one of our members of NENA, Future Dreaming Australia, which I'm very privileged to be part of, and it's led by Mary Graham and Ross Williams, host a range of webinars and symposia in case you ever want to connect to groups who are sharing different information about caring for country and how to decolonise our thinking. For those who don't know, I'm sure many of you have seen this photo a few times this week. I'd better change it for tomorrow and surprise you all. But this is a photo of the beautiful water lilies in Nudgee Nunda, which is Turrbal language for black duck waterhole, which is nearby where I live in beautiful, beautiful North Brisbane. So if you are able to pop in the chat, whose country you're on or where you're from, where you are today, let us know that you're out there. It's always lovely for people to be acknowledging country and recognising the remarkable place that we live in. Now to NENA Narratives Week, which kicked off excitedly on Monday. We're now in the middle of our week. What have we been up to? So on Monday, the lovely Chris Reedy, who was joining us today, and the always amazing Alana Marsh, and a recorded talk from the very remarkable Catherine Trebek started off our week, where we looked at why do narratives matter? How do we tell a compelling story about our society and economy that brings more people into dialogue? So if you missed Monday's session, the recording and including Catherine Trebek's short video recording are all available, will all be available. Yesterday, we talked about how we communicate and in an inspiring and succinct way to think about our visions for the future. And we had a really terrific talk from Alina Siegfried, and we had some really lovely interactive activities with Caress and Sophia from Wicked Elephants. Tomorrow in the evening, not in the usual daytime session, some lovely folks from NENA, including Fiona Brooks and her colleague Johanna de Ruta, will be running an interactive People Need People or warm data session, exploring the question about what is essential. And the warm data sessions are always well received. People really enjoy them, so we really encourage you to join folks. On Friday, we're going to be talking about how do we all become new economy storytellers? What tools can we use to tell new stories about ourselves, our society and our world? And that will be run by digital storytellers, and I'm really looking forward to that. And we do hope that bouncing off from that workshop will be other opportunities for folks within the NENA world to connect with some of the really cool tools that digital storytellers and other folks in the NENA network can share and exchange. But that brings us to today. Today is all about how do we tell a compelling, coherent story about the innovations that can take us to our imagined future, and how do our stories give people agency. What we've done, and we've nicknamed it NENA's Gruen Transfer, we're going to start with a presentation by Eleanor Glenn. Really looking forward to Eleanor's insights into the role of stories and the work that she does about values inside the common. Oh, I'm having a mental blank, Eleanor. I'm so sorry. Inside the work that her amazing organisation does, who I've attended workshops and I'm momentarily forgetting the name of. How terrible.
Common Cause Australia.
Common Cause Australia. Thank you, Eleanor. After Eleanor's presentation, Eleanor, myself, and Chris are going to put a little hat on and pretend to be part of that really awesome TV show called The Gruen Transfer. And what we're going to do is play a couple of different videos, and we will kick off a bit of a discussion about them and really analysing, are they part of the old economy, and what are the messaging and stories that they're sharing? Or are they part of the new economy? And if so, why is that? What is it that they're talking about, and how are they doing that? And huge apologies and sadness. Our beloved friend and colleague inside NENA, Rhiannon Hardwick, is unwell. She has the nasty COVID and won't be joining us. But that's about all I wanted to do by way of introducing our session today. Urge you to watch the recordings from the rest of the week. Join us where you can. But now I'm going to hand over to Eleanor Glenn from Common Cause Australia. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks for having me. And I'd like to acknowledge that I also live and work in beautiful Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I am going to share screen, and I know that this will work because we just tested it. Let me start the slideshow as well. Right, is that showing for everybody? It says why narrative?
Yes, looks wonderful. Excellent.
Okay, so if you've been in the previous sessions, a bit of introduction about why this is so important. So a nice quote here: we dream in narrative, daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, double, plan, revise, criticise, construct, gossip, learn, hate and love by narrative. In order really to live, we make up stories about ourselves and others, about the personal as well as the social, past and future. So if we want to create new futures, well, we do that in terms of narrative. You probably know this quote from Buckminster Fuller: you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So it's also saying, well, rather than just saying we don't want those things, what is it? What is this new thing? How do we describe that? How do we help other people see what it is? It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Again, like the Bucky Fuller quote, what are these new things that we want to bring to fruition? And some of them are old as well that we're reimagining. Or Bourdieu, the space of possibles, which is actually his bit of the quote, but really it's the idea that narratives shape the space of possibles. They shape what we see as possible in our futures when we tell that alternative story of what our world could be. So the way that I think about narrative is really that it's the deep kind of underpinnings of the more obvious kind of message that we might hear. The language, the words, the framing. So it's really deep assumptions about who we are as human beings and how the world works and what it could be. So we'll look a little bit more into what makes up narrative soon, but yeah, just to give you the idea that any sort of individual message or story will have a particular frame underneath it, and I'll go into framing in a second, and underneath that will be these often unspoken assumptions about us and about the world. Different people use different words for these, but really, yes, just if you take that idea of narrative, or here it's called deep narrative. So just as an example, the accumulation of lots of different individual stories of refugee or migrant boats crossing the Mediterranean could be understood through the framing to add up to a narrative that refugees or migrants are taking over. I would sort of more think of that as the story. The deep narrative, or the narrative, would be something like fear of the other. So that's the deep unspoken idea about who we are and how we feel about each other, which relates more directly to our view of human nature and the way the world works. Without this deep narrative being firmly embedded, the narrative of refugees and migrants taking over the world would not be necessarily so persuasive. So again, it's that idea of the space of possibles. If we have this kind of deeper understanding of ourselves and the world, then when we hear particular stories or frames that connect to that, they make sense to us. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about values and then frames. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's a values map based on the work of a social psychologist called Shalom Schwartz. He worked in the 70s and had the question, are there universal values that occur across countries and cultures? So he and his colleagues surveyed 65,000 people in 68 countries around the world. And these are the values that he found popped up across countries and cultures. And the interesting thing is that we all have these values to some extent, but prioritise them differently. And the other interesting thing is the way that the values clump together into groups. So the most useful thing to think about here when we're looking at different frames is this this idea of intrinsic values, so benevolence, universalism, self-direction. They're values that come from the self. So they're about caring for those in your close circle, benevolence, so friends, family, colleagues. Universalism is about caring for people you might never meet, things like social justice, and even beyond people to nature. So you've got protecting the environment, world of beauty, and so on. And then next to that, self-direction values, so creativity, curiosity, independence, and so on. And these values we've found time and time again in the real world, when these values are activated in us, they lead to more concern and action on bigger than self issues. So social and environmental issues, also just on an everyday, sort of in an everyday situation, helping others around us, for example. And then the opposite, extrinsic values that rely on external validation or reward, lead to less concern and action. So I won't go too much into that, but just to have this idea in mind that while we all have those different values, they will be turned on or activated by different ways of talking about an issue, different frames. So just an example, one frame for, say, people seeking asylum, just to build on that last quote, would be about welcoming people and common humanity. And an alternative one would be about boats and borders and terrorism, and they might be terrorists and that kind of thing, and keeping people out. So we can understand both of those, and each of those different frames will tap into different values. One final thing to point out on values is that values, emotions, and identity trump facts, which was hard for me to accept as a scientist, but they do. And so part of what we're looking in when we're analysing narrative is to think, how does this make me feel? So the values, emotions, and identity. Frames. So yeah, just call out or pop in the chat, what do you see here? Bunny and bird, duck. Both, duck, rabbit, bunny first, then a duck, maybe an albatross. Yeah, so people name them differently, whether you call it a duck or a seabird or something else, rabuck. So the interesting thing is, once you know where to look, you can see the bill of the bird on the left, which becomes the ears of the rabbit. And we can quickly toggle between those two things. So it's like the idea that, say, the duck is the first frame, the compassionate frame about welcoming people seeking asylum. The rabbit is that other frame. So we can understand both, and we can toggle quickly between them once they're pointed out to us. So just another way of, and they're just two different frames for that same issue. Another way of explaining this is that when we are framing, so consciously crafting something, a piece of communication, it's a bit like being a photographer, where we're deciding what we put in the frame and what we put out of the frame. So every situation can be framed one way or another way or another way. Every time we're making that choice, about what we put in the frame and what we leave out, we're telling a different story about that situation. Just to give another concrete example here, so I did some messaging research on encouraging people to support walking and bike riding measures like footpaths and bike paths and safer speeds and that kind of thing. And when I looked at all of the discourse out there, there were two really obvious frames that we can think of as the advocate frame, or the duck if you like, and the opponent frame. When I say opponent, I'm talking sort of the right out there, no, we should not have bikes on our roads or provide for people. So for example, Miranda Devine wrote that roads are built for cars. So I'm not talking sort of middle of the road thinking. It's just like, if you can think of the exact opposite of what we want, that's our opponent frame. So the advocate frame was streets are for everyone. People love walking and bike riding. Government should make sure everyone has options to walk and bike ride. Opponent frame, roads are for cars. People need to drive. Government shouldn't give special treatment to pedestrians and cyclists who get in the way of cars. So both of those are you've probably seen forms of those. You can understand them. I'm imagining most of it us on the call, probably more towards the supporter side, but you can understand both of those different ways of framing streets or roads. So just to get you thinking about what are some of the assumptions underneath these frames, and perhaps the values as well. What are you seeing there? So if we start with the advocate frame, what are some of those assumptions about why this is important, or who we are as people? Just call out if you like, or pop it in the chat. So health and well-being, yep, that's important. What else? Equity, yeah, so the idea that's for everyone, not just for people who can afford a car or use a car. Environment, the opponent frame is efficiency, just getting around the fastest way. Advocate frame, diversity of travel needs. Enjoyment, people love doing this. Opponent frame, values connected to ownership, individual rights. Change, openness or resistance. What did you mean by that one, Helen? Maybe if you can add to the chat. Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to jump in. It seems to me like a lot of the opponent frame is, look, this is the way it is. Roads are for cars. People need to drive. Government shouldn't. Why should we change? Whereas the advocate frame is, well, here are all the reasons we could.
Yeah, we could / should provide different options. Yeah, I can see that. There's also in the advocate frame the idea that government serves all of us, so that's part of their remit to make sure that everyone has those options. Okay, so that was just to quickly get you thinking about some of those assumptions and values, which are really the narrative that underpin those specific words, that specific story about walking and bike riding. And one more so commercial vehicles need efficient roads. Yep, for the opponent frame. All right, now we are mostly focusing on narrative, but I thought I would just give you this final piece of sort of an analysis tool and a way to think about how you might like to tell story. And that is vision, barrier, action. So basically it's a structure so that we start with an attractive and relatable vision that's widely valued by people. So the idea that most of us want to get around in ways that are healthy and enjoyable and safe. But there's something that stands in the way of that, which is our barrier. And therefore, the action is what we can do to overcome that barrier. So we start with the positive, so something that stands in the way, and we end with the positive and often the call to action, which is an alternative to, it's all too easy with all the problems in the world to just emphasise and start with barrier and problem. The benefit of doing it this way is that we flip people into a different frame of mind. Again, the space of possibles, the vision is something we don't yet have, but is within reach, or we can create it. So what it looks like, just because this is now a tiny bit familiar to you, vision barrier action here is essentially streets are for everyone. We all want to move around in ways that are healthy and enjoyable. Many people who currently drive would rather walk or ride a bike, but those options are not yet available to them where they live and work. So it's a very inclusive idea, rather than sort of vilifying people who drive. And governments can make sure everyone has the freedom to use and enjoy our streets. There's the freedom, the self-direction value, by creating wider footpaths, more crossings and bike lanes that give people more options to walk and ride a bike. So you can also see it's a very kind of abundant frame. It's more of, so more of us can do this. We have more of these things and more options available to us, rather than shutting down and kind of constricting. Final thing I just wanted to say, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, is this idea of greenwashing, which is really interesting when you start thinking about, okay, so if we know that, say for argument's sake, we're going to say the duck is that frame that leads to support for issues grounded in those intrinsic values we spoke about. And the rabbit is likely to lead to less support. You know, opponent frame, stop this thing that we want. What happens when a company says, oh, we love renewables, or we want to create this thing, and yet they're doing the opposite? Essentially, it's kind of a rabbit masquerading as a duck. But the thing that I think is really interesting about that is that they do that because they can see that renewables, for example, are desired by people, or that, you know, most of us want to welcome other people here. So they're latching onto an idea that has generally quite broad support, even though the methods they're going about it, so for example, to continue doing oil and gas, as we'll see in a moment, won't achieve that positive vision that we want. But I think it's promising. When you see greenwashing, the good thing to take from it is that, okay, well, there's probably a widely held desire and belief here that they're latching onto. So look out for that in a moment when we look at our old narrative from BHP. Which leads me to 4 prompts that I'm going to give you. So when we look at the videos, which Chris is about to play, we're going to show one kind of old narrative and a couple of new ones, and we wanted to spend more time on the new ones. Useful to see the old one because it illustrates a lot of things that are quite ingrained out there that are useful to spot. But yeah, focusing more on new narratives, and at the end, some time for you to think about what your narrative would be. So I want you to think about, how does it make you feel? That's just an easy sort of upfront prompt to get you thinking about those values and emotions. What are the underlying assumptions? So we looked a little bit at that for the walking and bike riding example. Or another way you can think of it is, what's the moral of the story? We should do this because of this. Third prompt, who's included in the narrative and who's excluded? And that's a little bit like the fourth one, to get you to think about, well, what are other ways of looking at this, and who's in it, who's been left out? So yeah, the fourth one, alternative ways of looking at the issue, alternative narratives that aren't being told here. And final prompt is just as part of that. In narratives, we're usually covering one or more of the why, the what, and the how. So the why is our positive vision. Why is this so important to us? The what is kind of what it says on the tin, like what are the things that we want to happen? For example, it might be a focus on showing renewables, or different ways of doing agriculture or sort of those specific solutions. The how is the process of getting from where we are now to the why and the what. And some stories capture part of that picture and not the rest, and some sort of more of those. Not necessarily that one way is better than another, but just, you know, that's different pieces of the puzzle that you could think about when you're looking at the narrative. So we've got those prompts in the chat. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, how does it make you feel? What are the underlying assumptions? Who's included and excluded? What are the alternative ways of looking at the issue? So have a think about those when you're watching them. For this first one, Chris, Michelle and I will do the Gruen transfer panel thing first. For the others, we might get some ideas from you first, and then we'll also chip in our observations.